Hello, I'm Nikki Going and I'm recording this presentation on behalf of Enhanced Language Services or ELS. This presentation is on Solitude by Ella Wheeler Wilcox, who is an American poet. I hope that you enjoy this presentation and you find it useful. Remember that you will never be examined on historical details or background information on a poet, but if you understand the poet and their context, it makes understanding their poetry much easier. Ella Wheeler Wilcox was born in Wisconsin in the USA in 1850. Like many of the poets whose work you study, she started writing poetry when she was very young. She was only 8 years old, and she was a published poet by the time she graduated from high school. She published several novels, essays, and volumes of poetry, and she also worked as a journalist. These were all quite unusual activities at a time when women were generally expected to lead very quiet, very private lives. She was also regarded as quite odd because of some of her beliefs and behavior. She was a vegetarian about 150 years before it was even fashionable. She fought for animal rights at a time when animals had to be useful while alive or farmed to be eaten. And she believed in ideas that were definitely not approved of by the largely Christian society in which she lived: karma, reincarnation, and spiritualism. Solitude is one of her most famous poems. She married Robert Wilcox in 1884, and unsurprisingly, there were some unusual aspects to her relationship with him as well. The couple had promised each other that the first to die would communicate with the other from the afterlife. After 32 years of marriage, Robert Wilcox died in 1916. Ella Wilcox was devastated because she couldn't hear a communication from the afterlife from him. Ella Wilcox herself died in 1919. I would suggest that you stop the video and spend 5 minutes jotting down some quick ideas before you continue. So what I would like you to do, just to get you into the mood for analyzing the poem, is look up the meaning of the word solitude and think about what the benefits and disadvantages of being solitary might be. As we discuss the poem, see if your ideas about solitude match up with those of the poet. Remember that solitude refers to a lonely place or a state of being alone or away from other people, and it comes from the Latin word solitudinem, meaning loneliness, and solus, meaning alone. Before we continue, I would like you to just jot down some ideas on how you think people would respond to the two people in these pictures. So stop the video and just jot down some of your ideas, and then after that you can carry on and see if your ideas match up with those of the poet. This is the story behind the poem. Ella Wheeler Wilcox wrote the poem Solitude after she had traveled to Madison, Wisconsin to attend a governor's inaugural ball. On her way there, she sat opposite a young widow who was dressed in black and was crying. The poet sat with her and tried to comfort her for the rest of their train journey. When they arrived at the ball, the poet was so depressed that she could hardly enjoy the party. When Ella Wheeler Wilcox looked at her own face in a mirror, she remembered the crying woman, and she wrote this poem where she thinks about the world's response to sadness. And as we go through the poem, I'd like you to consider whether or not you agree that this is how the world responds. Are people really quite so selfish and cynical as Wilcox perhaps suggests? As I read the poem, listen very carefully to the poet's use of rhyme and rhythm. I'm sure that you will notice that this poem is very carefully constructed so that rhyme and rhythm add to the balancing of ideas against one another. Remember that poems are written in order to be heard. They're like music. And whilst you can read music off a page, it makes far more sense to listen to it and just let it soak in. Solitude, Ella Wheeler Wilcox. Laugh and the world laughs with you. Weep and you weep alone. For the sad old earth must borrow its mirth, but has trouble enough of its own. Sing and the hills will answer, sigh it is lost on the air. The echoes bound to a joyful sound, but shrink from voicing care. Rejoice, and men will seek you, grieve, and they turn and go. They want full measure of all your pleasure, but they do not need your woe. Be glad, and your friends are many. Be sad, and you lose them all. There are none to decline your nectared wine, but alone you must drink life's gall. Feast, and your halls are crowded. Fast, and the world goes by. Succeed and give, and it helps you live, but no man can help you die. There is room in the halls of pleasure for a large and lordly train, but one by one we must all file on through the narrow aisles of pain. As I analyze the poem, I suggest that you take notes, highlight key phrases, and also make sure that you understand the technical language terms that I use. I will remind you what these terms mean when I use them, and I suggest that you write down any definitions that you didn't already know. This is because it's very difficult to analyze literature and poetry if you cannot use the correct vocabulary. It's a bit like walking into a maths paper and having no idea what plus and minus signs mean. It's also a good idea to work with a copy of the poem in front of you because then it's easier for you to take notes. And as we discuss the poem, think about whether Wheeler Wilcox is saying that people are inherently selfish and uncaring, or whether pain and suffering are actually just impossible to truly share with another person. People must think that there is some truth in what she's saying, as the words laugh and the world laughs with you, weep and you weep alone, have become commonly used as a proverb in everyday English. Remember that a proverb is a wise saying of the sort that irritating older people often throw at you. For example, when you trip and fall flat on your face and you hear this voice behind you that says, "More haste, less speed," that's a proverb. We will start with the discussion of the rhyme and rhythm scheme used in the poem. Ask yourself if the rhythm of this poem is regular or irregular, and how the poet creates this effect. Remember, as I said, poems are like music. They are written so that they sound a particular way when they are read out loud, and they are made to be heard. And a good poet will use rhyme and rhythm to emphasize and connect ideas. Once I've read the poem, I suggest that you stop the video and count the number of syllables in each line. Remember that a syllable is the smallest unit of sound that you can break a word down into. For example, laugh and the world laughs with you, line 1, consists entirely of words of one syllable. But in line 2, alone has 2 syllables. You can hear it, alone. If you have a repeated pattern of a predictable number of syllables in the lines of a poem, it creates a very regular, predictable rhythm. Think about the lines of "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are." You might be interested to know that every single line of that nursery rhyme has 7 syllables in it. I also suggest that you analyze the rhyme scheme using the ABC method. Once you've worked out the rhyme scheme for the whole poem and counted the syllables for each line, have a look at the next slide to see if you were correct and if you understand how to actually do this. It's a very useful skill when you are analyzing poetry, and you can use it for the analysis of the unseen poem. Solitude, Ella Wheeler Wilcox. Laugh and the world laughs with you, weep and you weep alone. For the sad old earth must borrow its mirth, but has trouble enough of its own. Sing and the hills will answer, sigh it is lost on the air. The echoes bound to a joyful sound, but shrink from voicing care. Rejoice and men will seek you, grieve and they turn and go. They want full measure of all your pleasure, but they do not need your woe. Be glad and your friends are many, be sad and you lose them all. There are none to decline your nectared wine, but alone you must drink life's gall. Feast and your halls are crowded, fast and the world goes by. Succeed and give and it helps you live, but no man can help you die. There is room in the halls of pleasure for a large and lordly train, but one by one we must all file on through the narrow aisles of pain. You can stop the video now and see if you worked out the syllable count and rhyme scheme correctly. I've indicated the syllable breaks in words with more than one syllable by using a red / and the number of syllables in each line with a red number in brackets after the line. If you counted the syllables in each line, you would have noticed that the line lengths are similar but not identical. So that creates a rhythm that's quite regular, but not as completely regular as if there was a definite pattern, like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or Olive Shrine as the morning sun is shining. If you worked out the rhyme scheme, as I suggested earlier, you would have seen that there is a definite pattern to the rhyme. The rhyme scheme and the arrangement of verses or stanzas work together to split the poem into 3 sets of 8 lines, which you can see on the page. Each set of 8 lines is an octave. You will know that oct is Latin for 8 from your studies of shapes in geometry. Each octave has a predictable rhyme scheme where the last words in the 2nd and 4th line and the 6th and 8th line rhyme. Remember the lines with even numbers. I've indicated the words that rhyme by using matching colored letters. Black letters are used for lines that do not rhyme with anything else. Then there are also internal rhymes, where a word within the lines rhyme. I've highlighted these for you in green, where the internal rhymes are on different lines, and yellow, where the internal rhymes are on the same line. Note that you do not have to learn all of this stuff off by heart. What I'm trying to demonstrate for you is how you can work out the rhyme and rhythm scheme in a poem so that you can comment on the structure of the poem if you need to. A very useful technique for the unseen poem. And if you don't know how to work out the rhyme scheme of a poem, this is a quick explanation. You just look at the last word in each line. The last word in line 1 is always marked with A because you always start at the beginning of the alphabet. So in this poem, U is marked as an A. If the last word in any other lines rhymed with U or are a repeat of the word U, they are marked as A as well. So for example, line 9 also ends with U. Line 2 ends with alone, and because alone does not rhyme with U, it gets the next letter of the alphabet, which is B. Any other words in a line that rhyme with alone also get marked with a B, which is why own in line 4 is also given a B. And you just work your way down from the first line, and every time you come across a last word in a line that doesn't rhyme with another last word in any lines, you give it the next letter of the alphabet. If you were asked what the rhyme scheme of the first octave is, you would say it is A, B, C, B, D, E, F, E. The second octave is A, G, H, G, I, J, K, J, and the third is L, M, N, M, H, O, P, O. However, being able to say this isn't really the point. You'll notice how in the first 2 octaves, 2 sentences have been split over 4 lines, which reinforces the rhyme scheme, and the focus on a slightly different theme every 4 lines. So remember that rhyme is used by poets for emphasis, to show how ideas are linked and sometimes to create a more definite rhythm. So whenever you discuss the rhyme scheme, you need to talk about it in terms of content and themes. Otherwise, who cares? As we discuss the poem, consider how the poet uses rhyme to reinforce content and themes. And you can hear how the rhythm and the rhyme scheme creates a musical quality, which is one of the reasons that this poem is considered to be a lyric poem. Note it's not described as lyrical, which is how you can describe a style of writing. The form of the poem is a lyric, just as some poems are elegies or sonnets or ballads. This one is a lyric. Solitude, Ella Wheeler Wilcox. Laugh and the world laughs with you, weep and you weep alone, for the sad old earth must borrow its mirth, but has trouble enough of its own. So as you look at this first octave, lines 1 to 4, you will notice how in lines 1 to 2, Wheeler Wilcox describes how people who are happy attract others, but if they are sad, others will leave them to suffer alone. In line 3, mirth means laughter caused by happiness. It's the kind of laughter you can see the people in the picture on the left are having. The poet argues that the earth, which is personified, has so much trouble and sadness that it has enough of its own. However, happiness or mirth is so rare that the earth has to borrow happiness from elsewhere. Notice how the poet has used a structure of pairs of lines to contrast ideas. In line 1, she discusses the consequences of laughter, and in line 2, she discusses the consequences of weeping or crying, which indicates extreme sadness. Lines 1 and 2 both start with verbs, laugh and weep, as the poet explains what will happen if the reader does these things. Line 3 contrasts how the earth has very little mirth or happy laughter, with line 4, where the earth is described as having more than enough trouble enough of its own. The ideas of being alone and on your own are linked by the rhyming of alone and own, as are the ideas of the earth and its shortage of mirth. Notice how the poet makes use of semicolons. That's the punctuation mark that looks like a full stop poised on top of a comma that appears at the end of lines 1 and 2. Remember that semicolons operate like a pivot on a seesaw. They link two sentences together that are of equal weight, and they show how those two ideas in the sentences are related to each other. Here, line 1 is about the consequences of laughter, and it's balanced against line 2, which is about the consequences of weeping. The semicolon at the end of line 2 balances this description of human nature with the explanation for it that follows in lines 3 and 4. There's so much trouble on earth already that no one wants any more. So the poet's using the technique of juxtaposition, which means placing contrasting words or ideas very close to each other so that you can highlight their differences. And she uses this technique throughout the poem. Note the tone of the stanza. It's bittersweet, reflective, and thoughtful. The poet's reflective tone and her discussion of emotions and emotional responses, by the way, are typical characteristics of lyric poetry. And in this stanza, in these 4 lines, Wilcox is implying that sadness is the natural state of the world. And you've got to wonder, if she's saying that sadness is the natural state of the world, does that mean that human beings are necessarily selfish and shallow because they want to avoid sadness? Or is it not just a natural reaction when there's so much sadness about? Sing and the hills will answer, sigh it is lost on the air. The echoes bound to a joyful sound, but shrink from voicing care. So in this first octave, lines 5 to 8, line 6, or bound, means to move in a big bouncing movement. Think about the way a kangaroo moves. And line 7, shrink from voicing care, is slightly ambiguous. The line can be read both as to avoid expressing sadness, care, or to avoid expressing caring or sympathy for sadness, and it works on both levels. Because Wilcox is again commenting on human nature. It's much easier to congratulate a friend in the good times than it is to sit with them when they are utterly miserable and depressed. To shrink means to get smaller, and the idiomatic expression shrink from means to move away from something that makes you feel threatened. You will have noticed that when people avoid danger, they generally make themselves as small as possible or shrink. In these lines, Wilcox describes how the earth, the landscape and earth's population, responds to happiness. If a person sings, it feels as though the landscape or the whole world, represented by hills, sings with them. Remember that when a part represents a whole, here the hills represent the whole world, then the poet is using the literary technique of synecdoche. Literally, they're singing echoes in the hills. However, if a person sighs with sadness, their breath out literally disappears as soon as it leaves their mouth. And metaphorically, their sadness disappears into the air and is gone as quickly as a sigh. Echoes here are personified as being happy to bounce or skip in response to happy sounds, just as people are generally happy to echo or repeat other people's happiness. But they do not want to repeat or voice sadness or care, or respond to sadness or care. Of course, you know that this is not literally true. If you scream or laugh in the mountains, you're likely to hear the same amount of echo. But in metaphorical terms, Wheeler Wilcox makes the point that the world wants to pass on happy thoughts rather than sad ones. Do you agree? Remember that Wheeler Wilcox was writing long before the invention of the internet and social media, where it sometimes seems that people would often rather like and spread sadness and pain than laughter and happiness. And although a point is that people are happy to spend time with you when you are happy and celebrating, and not interested in showing support or caring when you are suffering, you need to wonder whether that is in fact true of social media. Notice how the poet uses a similar structure as in the first 4 lines that we discussed. Again, she's using that structure to link ideas. Lines 5 and 6 are balanced against one another as she says what the results of singing as opposed to sighing are. And she contrasts these. Can you see that how these are again parallel sentences with very similar structures to highlight differences, where contrasting ideas are again juxtaposed? As in the first 4 lines of the poem, these lines start with the verbs sing and sigh, and the poet explains what will happen as a result. The ideas of sing and sigh are also linked by the alliteration of the S sound, which is also picked up in answer and lost. Incidentally, the alliteration of S is known as sibilance, and it's usually used with connotations of whispering or secrecy. Here it seems to reproduce or copy the sound of a sigh. And when you copy a sound, it's a literary technique known as mimesis, or when you copy an idea. It can also be considered to be onomatopoeia or onomatopoeic. In the last 2 lines, lines 7 and 8, bound and joyful sound are linked by an internal rhyme, showing how joy bounces around in happy echoes, and it is contrasted with shrink and voicing care, which are opposite reactions. The semicolon is again used in the same way as in the first 4 lines. After answer in line 4, it contrasts with lines 4 and 5, and the semicolon after air in line 5 tells you that the last 2 lines of the octave, lines 7 and 8, explain why singing and sighing create opposite reactions. Notice how these 4 lines are built on auditory or sound sensory imagery, with all those references to sing, sigh, echoes, and a joyful sound. In the second octave, lines 9 to 12, line 9, rejoice, means to feel or express great joy or great happiness. And the poet says that as a result, men will seek you. People will look for, try to be with you. And please note that men here doesn't only mean males. It means humanity in general. At the time when Wheeler Wilcox was writing, such language was not seen as sexist. In line 10, grieve means to feel great sadness, and the poet argues that people will turn away to go or leave you if you are grieving. Turn also has connotations of a complete change of behavior to betrayal, as in to turn against or turn away, which are more idiomatic or commonly used slightly metaphorical expressions in ordinary English. In line 11, the poet argues that people want full measure of your pleasure, which means that people want a full amount or a generous helping of whatever gives you pleasure. And it implies that they're actually quite greedy in this. And then she completes her argument with, but they do not need your woe, in line 12, where woe means great sadness. Note that this is an archaic word. It's language that's not commonly used today. Also notice how the poet has contrasted want and need. The poet describes how people want to spend time with those who are happy, but tend to leave those that are sad to deal with their sadness on their own. They don't need their woe. You can see this idea in Edvard Munch's famous painting on the right, where the figure screaming is completely isolated and lonely in his or her distress, despite the fact that there are another 2 people on the bridge. Again, the poet uses parallel sentences that starts with the verbs rejoice and grieve to illustrate the opposite consequences of these 2 actions. And note that rejoice and grieve are antonyms, meaning that they have completely opposite meanings. Look at how they've been juxtaposed in parallel sentences in order to highlight the fact that they're antonyms. Also look at how go and woe and measure and pleasure are linked by the rhyme scheme, but they are also very importantly linked in terms of the theme being discussed. And again, the poet has used semicolons at the end of the first two lines in the stanza in the same way that she did previously. Be glad and your friends are many, be sad and you lose them all. There are none to decline your nectared wine, but alone you must drink life's gall. So the second octave, lines 13 to 16, are structured in a very similar way. Lines 13 and 14 are again parallel lines, where the poet uses the verb phrases be glad and be sad, and describes the consequences of these actions. In line 15, she says that no one will decline or say no to or reject the reader's nectared wine. Now remember that nectared wine is a very, very old symbol of ultimate luxury and pleasure, because in Greek and Roman mythology, the gods drank nectar. And nectar is literally the extremely sweet, sugary substance that flowers secrete in order to encourage insects to pollinate them. Nectar is therefore, in terms of idiomatic English, the food of the gods, meaning the very best available, the ultimate in luxury. And of course, the Greek and Roman gods were immortal and didn't suffer as humans do. Therefore, nectared wine is also a metaphor for happiness and how attractive it is to others. Happiness, Wilcox implies, even seems to give people the godlike ability to avoid suffering. In line 16, the poet makes the contrasting argument. If a person has to consume life's gall or deal with things that are unpleasant or cause suffering, then they will inevitably do so alone. This is because gall is literally an extremely bitter substance produced in the liver. And sometimes when you have indigestion, you can taste that incredibly sour stuff at the back of your throat. That's gall. So metaphorically, life's gall is the bitter, sad events in life. And notice how the poet contrasts the sad events in life, life's gall, with happiness, nectared wine, and contrasts the effects of these. Again, the poet has repeated that structure of the first two lines being parallel sentences, where the verb phrases be glad and be sad are opposites or antonyms. The first line also ends in a semicolon, showing how it is balanced and linked to the second line, an idea that is emphasized by the fact that glad and sad are an internal rhyme, and that highlights the fact that they are antonyms. A dash and a semicolon usually function in much the same way, but here the second line ends in a dash. And changing this punctuation mark tends to catch your eye because it's a change from the previous pattern. And this perhaps highlights the importance of the two lines 15 and 16 that follow. Notice how the tone gets more and more bitter as the poem progresses. We've moved from weeping to sighing to the drinking of gall, which actually comes close to being a description of torture. And the extreme sweetness of nectar is contrasted with the extreme bitterness of gall in the poet's use of sensory imagery. Here she's using quite unusual sensory imagery because she's appealing to the sense of taste, otherwise known as oral imagery, O-R-A-L, by the way. The poet says that happy people tend to be surrounded by friends and sad people become isolated. And if you don't believe her, just think about how carefully people curate their social media profiles so that their lives look happy and perfect, and then they get thousands of followers. There is a change, however, in that instead of, as I said, the poet using a semicolon, she uses a dash, not a hyphen, by the way, which indicates that more detail is to follow. Everyone is happy to share the good times and pleasure with you, but you'll find that you have to suffer or go through hardship by yourself. So you can see that the poet's tone has become increasingly ironic. It's hard to completely believe in friendships that depend on a person never being sad, or that friends are people who abandon you when you're having a difficult time and you're drinking life's gall. So what I think you should consider is the poem and the poet just totally cynical, or is she actually quite accurate? Feast and your halls are crowded, fast and the world goes by. Succeed and give and it helps you live, but no man can help you die. So in this third octave, line 17 to 20, we see that in line 17, the poet argues that if you feast, literally eat huge elaborate meals, or metaphorically enjoy all the good things that life has to offer, then your halls will be crowded. Remember that halls are large rooms where people gather. So the poet argues that if you metaphorically feast or enjoy things in life, you will always be surrounded by people, so many people that you'll need large rooms or halls to fit all your friends and admirers in. Your halls will be crowded. In line 18, she contrasts the impact of feasting with that of fasting. Notice how these two verbs are linked by the alliteration of the F sound, so that the reader cannot miss the fact that they are antonyms. In line 18, the poet argues that if you do not participate in life and happiness, or if you fast, which means that you've deliberately chosen not to enjoy a pleasure, usually food, people will ignore you. They won't want to spend time with you. The people that you know here are symbolized by the world, and they will go by or ignore you. Basically, you'll be isolated and away from the rest of society of the outside world if you are not indulging in your appetites and enjoying the more pleasurable things in life. Notice how these two lines are again structured as parallel sentences, with the semicolon at the end of line 17 showing how they are related. In line 19, the poet says that if you are successful and give generously to others, not only material goods, but also if you give of yourself emotionally, you will live a good life. It helps you live. But this is a complete contrast to line 20. But no man, again, not literally males, means no person, can help you die. Now, here the poet is not saying that there is nobody that can help you to commit suicide, or that there is nobody that is willing to murder you. She's saying that literally we all go through the process of death alone. But it also implies that withdrawing from others is a metaphorical death, and that one will always go through that alone. Notice how give and live are linked by that internal rhyme in line 19, and the very careful positioning of the antonyms of live and die at the ends of line 19 and 20. And of course, the poet's comment is completely ironic. She's saying that although generosity will help you live, when you need someone to help you die, your generosity will not be reciprocated. You won't have someone to accompany you on your journey of death. And notice how this set of 4 lines has been split into 2 sentences, with enjambment of each sentence over 2 lines. So the first sentence focuses on the theme of fasting and feasting, and the second on the idea of how to live as opposed to how you will inevitably die. And I think that comment about death is a little bit ambiguous. You can read it that nobody's willing to be with you on your journey to death, or that even if people are willing, even if they would like to accompany you on that journey because they love you so much, death is inevitably a lonely and isolated and isolating process, and that everyone goes through their own death alone. There is room in the halls of pleasure for a large and lordly train, but one by one we must all file on through the narrow aisles of pain. In this third octave, line 21 to 24, line 21 continues the idea that if you enjoy the good things in life, you will have lots of friends who want to share the experience with you. By comparing pleasure to a palace in the metaphorical description of the halls of pleasure, metaphorically the poet is saying that these are the spaces in your life that are filled with joy and happiness, and that they can accommodate a lot of people like halls can, because so many people will want to share happiness and the good times with you. The large and lordly train described in line 22 is literally a description of the procession of people that follow an aristocrat or royalty. This metaphorical description implies that if you're enjoying pleasure and sharing that experience with others, they will treat you like royalty. And it continues the metaphor of pleasure being like a palace. Notice how the structure of the final 4 lines of this poem have changed from the previous octaves. Here, lines 21 and 22 deal with pleasure and the idea that happy people attract others and have large and loyal groups of followers. Sounds very much like social media to me. This is a complete contrast, highlighted by the word but, with lines 23 and 24. In line 23, the poet explains that we must all walk one by one or file on, which means to walk into a place in a line, one behind each other, through the narrow aisles of pain, described in the final line of the poem, line 24. So pain is compared to an aisle, which is a narrow passage between rows of seats. In the final line, the poet describes pain in this way and implies that people can only pass through pain on their own, because you can imagine that you can only go down a very narrow passageway on your own. And even though you can have people sitting on the sidelines, imagine people sitting on either side of an aisle and watching you, they cannot actually walk down that aisle at the same time as you, in the same way that people can observe you feeling pain, but they cannot feel the pain for you. So the words "we must all" imply that everyone will suffer pain, and that the journey through pain is ultimately one that everyone makes on their own. And I think that anyone who's watched helplessly as a loved one suffers can understand exactly what the poet is talking about here. So the tone of the poem in these final lines can be read as extremely cynical, as the poet comments on how everyone is happy to share your pleasure, but pain is an experience you inevitably endure alone. Remember, cynical means that you believe that people generally act selfishly or in their own best interests. So a cynical person expects the worst from others. But you can also read the poem as people don't share your death or your pain, not because they are selfish, but because it's actually impossible to feel those things for another person. So in this case, you can better describe the poet's tone as resigned. She's accepting what it is impossible to change. And I think you can interpret this either way. I'm not specifying one way or another. One other thing I'd like you to notice is how I analyzed that metaphor of pain being like a narrow aisle. And this is a method you can use throughout your language paper. So first of all, say what 2 things are compared. A narrow aisle is compared to pain. Discuss the characteristics of what you're comparing to. So I told you what the characteristics of a narrow aisle are. Only one person can walk along a narrow aisle at a time. There might be chairs on the side so people can observe, but they can't participate. And then finally discuss the implications of the comparison. This implies that pain is inevitably a solitary and lonely experience. And if you are methodical in unpacking metaphors and you use that method, I think you will find unpacking metaphors much, much easier in your language paper. Ella Wheeler Wilcox's poem Solitude is a brutal description of humanity as ultimately selfish, shallow, and uncaring. To what extent do you agree with this statement? Justify your response with specific references to the tone, diction, and imagery used in the poem. So before you start answering a question, make sure that you understand the technical language. Justify means to give evidence for your ideas from the poem. Remember that tone is the emotions that an author or speaker conveys with their words. It is related to mood, but it is not identical. Mood is the way that a reader or audience is made to feel, and unlike with tone, you don't need a speaker. Diction is the poet's choice of words, and imagery refers to figures of speech like sensory imagery, metaphors, similes, and personification. I'm only going to give you some suggestions of things you could comment on. if you are asked to write this poetry essay in the exams or in a literature assessment. And I will also talk you through the process of structuring a poetry essay as I discuss a possible answer. So this is just a model answer. Remember that an introduction to a literature essay should always include your hypothesis. Hypothesis is simply the big idea you're setting out to prove, and you get your hypothesis from the question. So start your hypothesis with the name of the text and the author, and then you follow it by rephrasing the question as a statement. And in that way, you will hopefully stick to the question throughout your essay, because this statement is what you are trying to prove throughout. You must also include a sentence where you will explain how you will structure your essay. Notice that your introduction is very short, 2 or 3 sentences at the most. So this is my introduction. Solitude by Ella Wheeler Wilcox can be read as a criticism of humanity as often selfish, shallow, and uncaring. But Wilcox does acknowledge that sometimes people suffer alone because of circumstances that are beyond anyone's control. Her ideas can be seen in the tone, diction, and imagery used in each octave of the poem. Now, you would have noticed that in my overview statement, I said that I would discuss tone, diction, and imagery in each octave. Therefore, the body of my essay should consist of 3 paragraphs, 1 on each octave. And in each paragraph, I need to specifically discuss tone, diction, and imagery, and link those to the idea of people basically being selfish, shallow, and uncaring, except where circumstances are beyond their control, because that was my hypothesis. Each paragraph should contain at least 1 argument that's linked to the topic of the paragraph, and that proves that Ella Wheeler Wilcox has this opinion of humanity. An argument should always consist of a point that you want to prove, evidence from the poem that proves that point, and an explanation of how the evidence proves the point. You don't have to put it in that order, but it must have those ingredients. So to remember the structure of an argument, you can remember the acronym PEE. P for point, E for evidence, and E for explanation. And if you like, you can add an L for a linking sentence to the next paragraph. So as I discuss the body of my essay, listen out for my PEEL structure, P-E-E-L, as I suggest what each paragraph could consist of. So in the first octave, Wilcox Wheeler has quite a resigned and accepting tone, as she simply describes humanity's generally selfish reaction to others, as if it is a fact, and simply the way that things are. She says, laugh and the world laughs with you, weep and you weep alone, and explains why this is inevitably the case. She uses the adjectives of sad and old to describe the earth, which is personified as having trouble enough of its own and having to borrow mirth because it is in such short supply. This implies that there's a shortage of things to be happy about. So although people are selfish for not wanting to deal with the pain of others, this is partly because people are usually dealing with enough of their own problems. Wheeler Wilcox also explains that if a person is to sing and express joy, others will sing with them. But if they sigh and express sadness, they will inevitably do so alone. Again, she gives the reason. People are attracted to celebration, so that the hills abound with joyful sound, but they are nervous about showing care. This octave implies that perhaps humanity is somewhat selfish, but part of the reason is that it comes more naturally to celebrate than to show care when people are sad. In the second octave, the poet points out that if a person rejoices, then they will have company. But if they grieve, they will do so alone. Because men, by which she means people in general, are happy to celebrate as a community, but grief tends to drive people away. Here her tone is more critical and sarcastic, which can be seen by her diction when she explains why this is the case. She says that people want full measure of all your pleasure, which implies that humanity is basically selfish and greedy, and that's implied by the diction of want and full measure, and that their focus on pleasure is shallow. When the poet says that humanity does not need your woe, her diction implies that people are so uncaring that they are only interested in their own pleasure or what they want, which is in complete contrast to what they do not need, another person's great sadness or woe. The imagery that follows also has a critical tone and emphasizes the poet's critical view of humanity. People will participate as fully as possible in the most pleasant aspects of a person's life. They will drink their fill of the metaphorically sweet aspects of their lives, symbolized by nectared wine. And having done that, they will leave the same person who gave them such pleasure to battle through the bitterest moments of their life, described with the image of life's gall. The contrasting diction of extreme sweetness and community with extreme bitterness and solitude highlights Wheeler Wilcox's feeling that humanity is completely selfish and uncaring. In the final octave, the poet's tone is cynical and bleakly despairing, as she uses the contrasting diction and consequences of a feast and a fast. She describes how people are happy to feast with one another, and that if people have a lot to give others, this will help them to live or have an enjoyable existence. However, if people fast or do not partake in the good things in life, it's unlikely that others will want to join them. Those people will fast alone. The line, "but no man can help you die," is somewhat ambiguous. It could be understood as either people are so shallow and selfish that they're happy to enjoy life with you, but will not be prepared to be at your side as you go through the traumatic experiences of death and pain. Or it could be understood that death is ultimately an experience that no one can share with another. Like pain, others can witness the process, but because they cannot experience it on your behalf or on behalf of another, death and pain are always solitary. This is simply the way that life is, rather than because people are selfish. And that idea is supported by the poet describing pain as an aisle, which is so narrow that people can only pass through it alone or one by one. In this instance, she does not imply that people have any choice in the matter. They didn't construct the aisle, and they don't dictate the nature of pain. Then remember, your conclusion is a very short summary of why your hypothesis is correct. So my conclusion would be the following. Based on the poet's shift in tone from factual to critical to cynical and bleakly despairing as the poem progresses, her use of diction and imagery, it seems that she does not feel that humanity is largely selfish, shallow, and uncaring, but that some circumstances like pain and death are beyond our control, and therefore we have no choice but to face them alone. So there are a couple of notes. You don't have to say that a statement in an essay like this is totally true or totally false. You can take a yes and no approach, which is what I did here. I said it was somewhat true. You also do not have to agree with my views. You could have a totally different opinion, and you could still get 100% for your answer and have it marked as a correct answer. Remember that the only correct answers in literature are those that you can prove with evidence from the text. And note that you can use the structure that I've just explained to write any literature essay or any other discursive essay. So, for example, it's very useful for history essays. I will create a specific video on structuring discursive essay writing, but I hope that this just gives you a quick and hopefully helpful formula that you can always use. Those that follow includes vocabulary that you will find useful. Note that the vocabulary is generally listed in the order in which it was used, and please check that you understand each word, make sure that you can spell it correctly, and then enjoy using it when you're talking about this poem. So for general vocabulary, I used the words cynical and resigned. For vocabulary about structure, you can use terms like syllable and syllable break, regular rhyme, internal rhyme, and rhythm scheme, octave, verse, and stanza, lyric poem, enjambment, parallel sentences, diction, including colloquial or conversational language, archaic and idiomatic language, and repetition. When you discuss figures of speech or you're asked to comment on figures of speech, please be very careful and don't mix them up with parts of speech. Remember, parts of speech are things like nouns, adjectives, verbs. Figures of speech are language techniques used to make language more interesting. And if you mix them up in a test or an assessment, the consequences are disastrous because you will not be answering the question. So some of the figures of speech that I mentioned are proverbs, synecdoche, mimesis, juxtaposition, contrast and antonyms, sensory imagery, symbols and symbolism, ambiguity, mood and tone, irony and sarcasm, metaphors, similes and extended metaphors, and connotations and implications. And then finally, I discussed the phonic devices in the poem in quite a lot of detail. So remember that phonic devices are language techniques that affect the way that a poem sounds when it is read out loud. And if you are asked to comment on phonic devices, it will usually be phrased as comment on phonic devices or comment on the sound effects. Don't give phonic devices in answer to a question about figures of speech. Technically speaking, they are a figure of speech, but they are asked for in terms of phonic devices or sound devices. So these are the major ones. There's rhyme, and remember you can spell it, rhyme has you and me. Rhythm, which can be spelt as rhythm has your two hips moving. Alliteration and sibilance, assonance and onomatopoeia. Thank you. I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation and found it useful. I have created this channel so that any learner or teacher who's working with the South African NSC curriculum can have access to detailed teaching and learning materials. And if you would like to support me in producing these videos, please like and subscribe and pass the link on to any and all of your friends who would find it useful. You are also very welcome to make a small donation to support this work, but I really don't expect it. The point of this channel is that it is free for users, particularly users that are lacking in other resources. And if you do want to make a donation, please use the PayFast link in the channel description. Have a great day.